Isola by Brenden Fletcher, Karl Kerschl, Msassyk and Aditya Bidikar was one of my favourite things in comics, and a trend that has been increasing recently on relying heavily on silent reaction shots of characters. It's got one on basically every page in its first issue, and it's a great way to add some emotional weight and resonance to the story while also asking your reader to become invested in the story by filling in some gaps. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So Isola is a really good example of the silent panel, because so much of the opening chapter relies on visuals more than dialogue or caption boxes or narration or anything like that. Only one character speaks for the majority of the issue, and so the team opts to try and tell you a lot about their relationships instead through the link of visuals. It almost always works the same way in the opening chapter as well. And if we look at the first page, we can see a good example. You've got the character here, Rook, who looks forward with her eyes closed, sleeping. Then we see a shot of the tiger, which is Queen Olwyn, and we go back to the panel of Rook, now awake and looking presumably in the direction of Olwyn. With no dialogue, we're forced to work with a little more to understand what's happening in the sequence, because we're seeing someone perform an action that we have to interpret. And that's the key thing about this trick. We learn to understand more directly the relationship between panel 1 and panel 2, and subsequently panel 2 and then panel 3. Panel 1 and 2 make us see two characters who are asleep. The third panel changes the relationship when we see Rook snap awake and looking at the tiger. But we can also read her reaction, eyes wide, open, slight concern with the raised eyebrows. We're putting the puzzles of the page together ourselves a little more here. She's concerned about Olwyn's welfare in the rain with no blanket covering her. On the second page we get another sequence constructed in the same way, 3 panels, the first and third shots of Rook's face in silence. The middle panel is what she's looking at. So the first panel we have to read her face to understand what's happening. The squinted eyes, the pursed mouth, the furrowed brow, this is acting. There's concern but a toughness that contrasts with the softness we saw a moment ago of her placing the blanket on the tiger. And again, by being silent, the comic is really making us do this work of reading the reaction, because it doesn't give us any other option. There's no out, as it were. No dialogue balloon next to Rook's face saying, well, what was that suspicious noise I heard, be on guard Rook, or whatever. So you have to read the face. The second panel shows what Rook is looking at. We see it very obviously as Rook looking, and then seeing what she's looking at, and we have to see that nothing is there. We're actually investigating the image now a little bit as well to see if she can see anything. Then that third panel is Rook having turned away. Again, we read the face, the movement, and essentially the acting of the panel, and the page forces us to do that. It's kind of like reading a novel where as a reader you have to fill in certain gaps yourself, like visualizing what a character looks like after reading a description of them, filling in the gaps of how they move, what they sound like, because that's all part of the power of that medium. And when you do that, you've helped to build the story yourself, and so you kind of become a little bit more invested and included in the narrative. Here it's a similar proposition, I think. You're being asked to understand the images on the page and their relationship to each other much more directly than if you were being guided along by dialogue or captions, which would be telling you what's happening. My favourite example of it comes halfway into the issue. A giant dead bird is sat among a field, and animals have started eating the meat. There's 4 panels that are almost exclusively silent in the middle of this page, and they are really exquisite. The first shows one of the antelope creatures eating the meat, and then we see a close-up reaction shot of Olwyn watching them. So the book is already subconsciously asking you to work on piecing the images together into the narrative, and Isola just asks you to take that one step further. We see a fairly grotesque image of antelope eating, blood around their mouths, bits of intestines and guts and junk on the floor around them, and we see Olwyn's response. Now, individually, if you just looked at that panel of Olwyn's face, it doesn't mean very much. It's a face that maybe shows surprise or shock or even horror or excitement, difficult to ascertain directly. When it gets placed next to the image of blood, it adds some context, for me something closer to shock. The next panel then crops in further on the mouth of the antelope eating the meat, and then we see Olwyn start to move. It follows the same structure as the other examples, a shot of one thing, then a reaction or response shot, then back to the original with a slight change. This time they do add the 4th panel of Olwyn as well, but the invisible structure underneath is mostly stuck to. And that structure works because it presents us some information in each case, and then it contextualizes or reinforms that visual with a reaction shot or an explanation of what a character is looking at, and then it goes back to the first shot to compound an additional set of meaning on top of it. It sounds quite complicated, but it's really simple. In the first example, we see Rook sleeping, and then we see Olwyn without the blanket on her, showing 2 people asleep, but also showing that Rook is not in the tent with her, so likely she's watching guard. And then it further compounds by having Rook shocked and worried that Olwyn isn't covered by the blanket. The second example does it by having Rook stern face, looking off in the distance. Then it's contextualized with the shot of where she's looking, telling us nothing is there, and then compounded or reinforced by Rook then turning away, somewhat satisfied and relaxed by the situation. In each of these moments, it kind of takes its time getting there. but by doing so is able to reveal you a lot about the characters and their motivations and what they're doing. Here on the final example, we have animals eating meat, then Olwen's reaction, this time being informed by the previous visual and compounded by the next shot of the close-up of the antelope's bloodied mouth tearing at another bit of flesh. And all of these sequences, they are wordless. I'd also argue that each one is stronger because of that, in that forcibly making you read the images themselves to understand context and relationship, it forms a stronger bond, and it allows you to be part of the reaction and also the process that the characters are going through in the comic. You're actually becoming an active participant in understanding the story within the book because you're doing the same kind of work that they are. It's never going to be for everyone, but when it's pulled off well as it is here in Isola, it can be really, really engaging. Thanks for watching. Strip Panel Naked can be supported at the Patreon page, where you can get access to years of exclusive content and writing from me. I'd love your support. You can get my monthly magazine Panel by Panel at panelxpanel.com, and I'm on Twitter at HassanOE. Finally, hit subscribe and that notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.